But your face is going to be on the screen anyway, so it's fine.
Right, Lee, have you kicked the stream off?
It's just publishing.
Ah, cool. I'm just watching, just monitoring that it's going out. Oh, screen's gone blank.
We're live.
Oh, and what a start!
But your face is going to be on the screen anyway, so it's fine.
Right, for the benefit of everyone on YouTube, we are joined by a guest tonight, and it's just cut away from him.
It's just publishing.
Ah, cool. I'm just gonna have to mute this.
Because everyone can hear it.
There we go. Right, that's that muted. Right, can you still hear us all right, Craig? You still there? And
yes, I'm
virtually virtually as well as.
Yes, with my my lovely face shot for everyone to stare at. Yeah, hello, good evening, everybody.
Considering the hoops we had to jump through, like technology-wise, to do this, that's a very low-tech solution.
One of these days we will get a second video streaming.
Yeah, we'll work out how to do it.
Yeah, just want to check with everyone watching on YouTube that the sound is good.
Yeah, comment and tell us that we're doing okay or not okay. And then
validate us, please. Validate us.
Validate us. Validate my life, please. And then we'll start the podcast if we're all ready to go.
I'm just waiting for the comments to come in, but nothing's happening because we've got like, oh, I've got crunchy mic stand.
No, don't mess with it.
Don't move that.
Don't mess with it. Talk, but don't mess with it.
I'm talking.
Okay.
No, it's a bit quiet.
Everything's a bit. Should we turn the main level up?
YouTube is.
I don't know.
Is there a main YouTube level to turn up?
No.
Oh dear.
So we're just going to have to do that and
turn your laptop up.
Yeah, sounds fine. Dan's a bit 2D. Yeah, no, Dan tonight is a little bit under the weather, so get well soon, Dan.
Yes.
We'll say that on the main show as well.
Soundies.
Right, are we ready to kick things off?
Yep.
I think so.
Right, Lee, you have control. Hi, and welcome to this week's 3Legs4Wheels F1 podcast. It's Paul here with
Chris.
Lee.
And our special guest.
Craig Scarborough, that's me. Yeah.
Craig Scarborough, ladies and
I've
gentlemen.
got to introduce myself now.
How you doing? You all right, Craig?
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much.
Good.
Yeah, really enjoyed the season, and seems a shame we've only got a couple of races left now, doesn't it? It's been quite a cracking season, all in all.
It's flown by. I can't believe how quickly it's gone.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like 10 minutes ago we were falling asleep watching the French Grand Prix.
Exactly.
Still want the sprinklers.
No. Tells you what kind of season it's been, though, doesn't it? If like we're still talking about the one boring race of the season. So, you know, everything's been.
Well, before we started recording, we spoke about hydrogen bombs, didn't we?
Yeah.
I think I might have thought how we can fix that circuit.
Oh, just completely.
I think the population of Nice may have a bit of an issue with that.
Just a small one. Just about circuit size.
Oh, Bernie would love you forever, Lee.
He can be there, I don't mind.
It's his circuit. He'd probably want to see it get blown up.
Maybe.
Yeah, he's probably got it insured, so I wouldn't worry too much about it.
In fact, if it's that well insured, he'd probably encourage it.
Yeah.
We are not encouraging bombing anything.
No.
Never.
Just
in case anyone's listening.
No, exactly. So, Craig, the last time we had you on the podcast, we were talking about post-summer break upgrades, and we were all really excited because Ferrari had brought this upgrade, and they were expecting to be a lot closer in the second half of the season, and they kind of blew everyone away for the first few races after the summer break, and then they didn't.
No.
What happened?
This is probably one of the most, probably the most difficult question you can ask me, other than why are Williams where they are. I think Ferrari, they've certainly turned that car around. So we know that the car at the beginning of the season was running very low downforce to improve the drag in order to get high top speeds, and that's worked kind of well for them. But we knew their slow corner performance was really kind of lacking. What they've managed to do over the summer was to try and turn that picture around a little bit. So we know they've got much better slow corner performance now. We know they've got much more downforce now. And as you know, everyone's been pointing out, there's been no lack of power from that Ferrari, particularly in its qualifying mode. Doesn't seem to show up quite so well in the races. So I think they've done a lot right with that car, with the upgrades that they did over the summer and in the early part of the sort of the post-summer season. I think where Ferrari are lacking really is in their racecraft, which is lacking from partly from a driver perspective, but also from a team strategy perspective and a whole weekend sort of strategy perspective as well. And they're not really making the most of the car that they've got. And then when you then compare that to Mercedes, who, you could argue haven't had the best car all year. I mean, the margin between how good the Ferrari is and how good the Mercedes is as a whole is, very finely balanced. But Mercedes have just been operating at a much higher level through the weekend. So, they've been prepared to give up the qualifying. But their race tyre management has been so much better, and they've been so much better at making the calls through the race. And I think that's really where Ferrari are being shown up. I don't think it's necessarily in the performance of their chassis. Maybe partly in the use of the tyres during the race, and where they decide to use the performance of the car. But really, they're just being outraced and outthought by Mercedes on the Sundays, it seems to me.
Interesting point there. And there was a lot of talk last weekend in Mexico about the fuel flow, with it being questioned, is something in particular legal or not? And all of a sudden it said the decision came from on high that no, this wouldn't be legal if anyone used it, and then Ferrari suddenly lose time. Were they worried about getting found out, perhaps?
Again, the answer is nobody knows, apart from Ferrari and maybe someone that is now at Red Bull that has some information on Ferrari. I think you can't take too much from the one race that we've just had in Austin. Obviously, it was a bit of a mixed-up weekend with the temperatures, with the with some rain and the wind. And it certainly looks like Ferrari were running a lot more downforce in order to get that car working, and to particularly get its tyres working, because the Ferrari likes hot conditions to get the tyres going, doesn't like it being nearly 0 degrees. So Ferrari would have cranked on more wing than they perhaps would have wanted to run at a hot Austin. And that has affected their straight line speed. Now, I don't know when that technical directive that was issued on Red Bull's request came into force, but I don't think it would have had an impact necessarily on Ferrari at the first race they'd have turned up to. So I think we can read a bit too much into Ferrari's lack of straight line speed, and obviously losing the race despite pole position at Austin because of all these other factors. So we'll need to see how that pans out for the balance of the season. But what Red Bull have suggested is really just another one of these things that everyone's been stabbing at Ferrari for the past few years. It's like the twin batteries, that we had this oil-based intercooler, which was the big guess just a few weeks ago, which is utterly nonsensical. So Ferrari are doing something very clever with the car. Whether it's legal or not, it's very hard to say. But what it seems to be the suggestion now is that they're tricking the fuel flow meter that sits in the fuel tank, which ensures that you're only delivering fuel at this 100, I think it's 105 kilograms, 110 kilograms per hour, as a kind of snap figure.
That's the rate, isn't it? It's not the actual fuel that's on board. That's the rate of the fuel flowing.
That's it. Yeah. So it's that. Although we call it as a per hour figure, it's the instantaneous equivalent of that, which they measure at 22 hertz. I think I seem to remember the figure is. So you're getting lots of people pointing ideas at Ferrari, but none of them seem to be backed up by either fear statements or what we're seeing on the track. So it's the same pretty much as we had last year. And I think everyone likes to suggest that as soon as Ferrari's got a powerful engine, it's cheating. And then you've got people like Mercedes going, oh, it's terrible, we're going to need more power to beat Ferrari. But, since 2014, Mercedes have had clearly more power. They boasted about their party mode, which was the oil burning setup they had for qualifying.
Yeah.
And it just kind of feels a bit of double standards, but people will point the finger at Ferrari and call them cheats. And there wasn't the same level of rigor at other engine manufacturers in the sport. But I think we'll need to see what happens both this weekend and Abu Dhabi, if indeed, there is something to be seen. And from Ferrari now, they've lost the championships. Red Bull have a degree of challenge to them, haven't they? But Ferrari could actually just switch some stuff off and let this go and bring back whatever they had in their back pocket in the engine this year for next year and catch everybody out again. So a little bit too early to say, but there's lots of accusations and very little sort of factual stuff put forwards around all this.
Yeah, case of throwing enough mud and hoping something sticks.
Exactly. Everyone has a theory, and you can look at the forums, and you can even look at the mainstream motorsport media. They were backing up this idea of an oil-cooled intercooler, which from a thermal perspective, just doesn't make any sense. And then having it somehow leak the oil into the high pressure air inside it just doesn't sound like a feasible way of doing things when there are much easier mechanisms to actually get oil into the engine, if indeed that's what they were doing to get this boost of power.
Yeah.
Do you think the idea that Red Bull and Ferrari are coming towards Mercedes is a bit of a false dawn? Because all year I've sort of thought, when people have been like praising Ferrari in particular, you've had a Mercedes which has had to like almost take a hacksaw to the car at times to get more cooling into the engine.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a case that Mercedes have built a bad car and it's not the fact that the other teams have caught up? And when you do something wrong, I think you learn more than you do when you do something right. So next year Mercedes will probably build a normal Mercedes car and then be back to where they were.
I think there's nuggets in everything you say there, which is true. I mean, I don't think this is a Mercedes that's had the level of dominance as it's had for the past handful of seasons. We saw that during testing, particularly in the second week of testing when they did have the updated bodywork. But the car just looked a handful. And in those first races, Ferrari kind of threw those races away. At a point when I think Mercedes were really struggling to understand the car that they had and how to work with the tyres. Ferrari have definitely made a step, and I think as we kind of got into that summer break period, I think Red Bull kind of got into their stride as well. Honda had started to deliver the power, and Red Bull were then starting to back that up with a chassis that can make the most of it. I think Mercedes have taken a step back, Ferrari and Red Bull have taken a step forwards, and they've got pretty close to each other. And it really is, as I was kind of speaking about earlier, it's a case of who's really then grabbing the advantage. And it's been very much Mercedes in the races, and Red Bull have operated races really efficiently because they know they can't qualify as well because they just don't have that power during qualifying. So it's always tricky, and I think Ferrari have kind of given us a bit of a false dawn because we had that testing performance that we was also impressed with, and other aspects of their car are good, but they tend to be very good on a Saturday and not necessarily on a Sunday. And lots of people still love qualifying, and it's a great spectacle. But in terms of really detecting what is a really good car, it's not necessarily the most important part of the weekend. As very few races this year have been won from pole position, and I think that Ferrari really is it's what it's lacking. It's lacking on a Sunday rather than what it lacks on a Saturday. So it's very hard to judge the cars in isolation. And this year, we've had lots of very complicated weekends with windy weekends, as you said, in Austin, temperature variations, weekends where it's been wet through practice, drying out for the race day. It's very hard to predict what these Pirelli tyres are doing, as much of the midfield will love to tell us about at length. So it's been a really tricky year, and where we go for next year is very hard to predict because I think Red Bull will be a lot bolder next year. Now they know that they've got a power unit that is within percents of the Ferrari and the Mercedes. Ferrari, have they got something in their back pocket with the engine? We don't know. I think Mercedes, with their early season success, also turned off the development of their car quite a bit this year.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Which doesn't bode very well for the rivalries for next season. But maybe has brought us a slightly more exciting second half of the season than perhaps we deserved. If they had been really fully on it, I think there maybe would have been a bit more Mercedes dominance. So it's all very hard to predict. But yeah, certainly next year, Mercedes still have got that kind of winning advantage, but clearly Red Bull and Ferrari haven't been standing still. If they can make another step over the winter like they've done this year, hopefully we can have a competitive year next season before obviously everything goes up for grabs in 2021.
I was just going to say, I take it that as far as next year goes, every team's going to want to come with, every team obviously wants to come with the best car they can do, but knowing that development is probably going to be halted much quicker next year than it usually is through a season, I'd have thought. So that must be on their minds, going into Australia.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because we've got very few rule changes for next season, which means that lots of teams will want to jump on the bandwagons that have been favoured by the leading teams and the midfield teams that found success with different suspension geometry and different aero setups, wheelbase lengths and stuff like that. Someone could want to spend a lot of money trying to put right what's been wrong in their chassis, and with that you would start to look particularly towards the back of the grid. I think Williams would be a team that would want to put a lot of effort into the 2020 car. Obviously, the top three teams will put huge effort into the 2020 cars because they know there's another championship for grabs. The balance of the midfield, you would have to say, how much would they want to rest on the laurels that they've gained in 2019 and think, we're going to invest a bit less money and a bit less effort into the 2020 car because we really need to be getting the program going on the 2021 car. And as much as the regulations do allow free development for 2021, at the end of the day, these people, and I think was it Horner was saying it's going to be the most expensive year ever in Formula.
Yeah.
Well, that's only if you've got an unlimited amount of money to draw upon. If you think of the midfield, most of them won't even reach the value of the budget cap in 2021 anyway. So they've not got a bottomless pit. So they still need to decide where they spend their money. And they really should be looking at the longer term projects for 2021 than throwing huge amounts of cash and resources at 2020. Everyone will have their own balance in between how that works out. But certainly if I was, technical director of a midfield team, I would certainly be erring on the side of 2021 more than I would on 2020.
So does that mean we could be going into the season with a reasonably big gap then between the midfield cars and the top three? That's going to get substantial before the end of the year.
I think probably when we hit Melbourne, I think it will have closed up a bit because fixed regulations and teams doing a bit of catch up tends to tighten the gap in the field. I think what you'll find is as the season progresses, certainly the top three teams and the teams with a lot of resources in the midfield and with teams like that, you're probably thinking McLaren have probably got the budget and the size of team to kind of really throw money at this. Potentially Renault have, but we've got lots of other issues ongoing with Renault, it seems.
Yeah.
If you rest this week. There could be an increasing gap, and certainly anyone that's come out with a bit of a lemon of a car or is right at the back may very quickly decide, pre-summer to really wholly focus on the 2021 car. And I think that for a lot of teams, I still think that would be a really sensible way of doing things because, it is sacrificing a season, but if you can make a jump quickly in 2021, as we saw whenever we've had these other big regulation changes, you can make a big jump very quickly with a big change in regulations.
It's got to be something Williams are thinking of because if they're already so far behind now and the regulations are staying the same, they've got a huge gap to make up before they make the gap up that's going to be there next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, with the teams that are struggling, I think the teams need to be honest with themselves and understand why they've been struggling. Is it because they've not had the money to put into things? Is it because they just simply have made some mistakes and it hasn't paid out? Or is it because they thought they had a great car, but when they then measure it on track, it's not the great car that the simulation and the CFD suggested? So in that case, you've really got to make sure that you've got either good or why it's bad. And there's no point trying to redesign a completely new car for 2021 if you haven't got those fundamentals understood yet. So teams like Williams may actually want to throw quite a bit of effort into 2020 to prove they're on the right track before they then divert that thinking into a completely new car, or else all you're doing is just making new mistakes over old ones.
As we're on the sort of 2021 cars now, were you surprised by that press conference? Because remember, last time we were on, we were talking about how much of a watered down version we were going to get of the new regulations, and it seems to be very much what we thought they were going to be before we thought they were going to be watered down.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, I think they've obviously chosen their battles quite carefully, which is what you would expect from someone as wise as sort of Ross Brawn. So they've given up on some of the fixed specification parts like the gearbox and the brakes and other bits and pieces like that. So I think they've kind of, handed back to the team some control with areas like that. But with what we saw from the aerodynamic setup, and I think that really is the kind of the key thing that it was launched at that press conference, and with the new regulations, is that the wholesale change to the aero on the cars that has actually remained unwatered down far more than I would ever expected. I thought they were going to play with things a lot more and succumb to some of the team's pressure, but that doesn't seem to have happened. So hopefully, all the diligent work that Ross Brawn's team has been doing on the aero side will pay off by giving us better racing with these cars, which is what it's all about.
Well, we did see the aero simulations, and it looks like the air coming out the back of the cars is a lot cleaner than it has been in previous years. So if cars can get closer, but then you get the issue of will it still cause problems with the tyres? And we've been hearing that nobody seems to be keen on the 2020 spec tyres that have come through, which doesn't bode well for what rubber they're going to be using the following year when everything changes.
Yeah, I mean, that could really be the sort of the deal breaker. Really, obviously, the teams have only had one test on a very cold, very green, and slightly damp Austin circuit at the last race. So, they're making judgments based on very limited data and very unrepresentative data. So hopefully they'll get a chance to test those tyres again. I think Pirelli have a way of designing a tyre based around what the FIA ask for. And, it is this tyre that, has the high degradation, but is also not so much the degradation, but it's how that tyre then starts to manage its internal temperatures. So whether it struggled to heat it up or if you get thermal runaway because the tyre is sliding. And that seems to be the issue teams have with the tyre, with the Pirelli in particular, which is something you haven't had previously with Michelin's and Bridgestones and obviously going back. And then you obviously for 2021, we're going to an 18-inch wheel rim with a very low sidewall tyre, which is totally new for Formula One. I mean, I can't remember when we last had a very low profile tyre. Obviously in the 70s, you had a relatively small front tyre, but then you had the massive balloon rear tyres back in those days because of the difference in the weight distribution. So this is going to be something completely new. We've seen McLaren testing this week with the low profile tyres. All that data gets shared with all the other teams via Pirelli. So they'll know what's coming. But, it really is a big question mark for 2021. How will teams cope with the tyre performance? How will they cope with the suspension performance, which again is a quantum change for what they've been working on for the past forever, effectively. I mean, what's the oldest team that's out there? It's Ferrari. They've raced on balloon tyres almost forever, really, haven't they?
Yeah.
So this is this is going to be a big change for the teams, and this potentially is the kind of the fly in the ointment for all of the good work that's been done. But equally, then that potentially gives us the chance for someone to come up with something very clever in one of the midfield teams and, outthink the top three teams, which is, I think, what we all kind of hope with, that there will be something of a reset in terms of, the competitive order. I think we can hope for that, but at the end of the day, the bigger resources always tend to win out, and if you have a good idea, it's very quickly copied. So, it's I think tyres will be interesting.
It's a stability thing as well, isn't it? With the new tyres, obviously the lower the profile on the tyres, the less tyre movement you get. So that's obviously going to put a lot more, as you were saying just then, about how they're going to changes how the suspension works and everything. It's going to be a completely different setup change just for these bigger wheels and small, lower profile tires. I've seen the the road relevance sort of thing as well, because being brought up with this, because obviously nobody buys a car with 13-inch wheels anymore. I haven't been able to do that since the 80s. But the but low profile tires, 18-inch wheels, something that people can relate to with their own cars, etc. Do you think that gives the manufacturers like Mercedes, Renault, that gives them like a little bit of a head start, because they know how their performance cars work with these lower profile tires, even though they're going to be completely different, but it gives them a little bit of a jump start ahead of the garagista teams like Williams and McLaren, for example. Well, McLaren make their own cars, of course. So ignore McLaren, but over Williams and, say, Racing Point, for example.
I take your point. I don't know if the knowledge would come from the road car side of a company, rather than perhaps, for Mercedes, DTM, which obviously run low profile tires. You've got lots of teams running in World Endurance and in touring cars. So I think it'd be much more the motorsport side of low profile tires than the road side. And, there's lots of very good tire engineers out there. There's lots of, software packages and knowledge out there which the teams can draw upon. And I say that and it makes it sound all very straightforward and simple, but you've got lots of factors that are going to affect the tires. So as you say, lower profile tires, stiffer sidewalls means the tire will generate much less heat. And what teams are doing at the moment when they can't generate heat is they use the heat from the brakes. But what you'll have with the new brakes and the new wheels is there'll be a bigger gap between the brake and the wheel. It'll be much harder to transfer heat between the two, which then means that there's one of these tuning options or the setup options that the teams have got currently, which they won't have in 2021. And then you've got the suspension movement and how the damping is required. And everything changes. And, you could argue that to change the aero and the tyres in one season is too big a step. And obviously they've stepped back from changing the power units for 2021 as well. I think it may have been better to actually introduce the tyres either a year earlier or a year later to the aero change, or vice versa, just to give the teams, a chance to focus on something, let that stabilize before, playing with the next thing.
Yep, makes sense.
I can see Haas having plenty of fun with that, because they've been struggling to get heat into the tyres at the moment. They'll probably work it out towards the end of next year, and then they'll get to 2021 and they're back in exactly the same position that they were in before. Probably just as well for them. They're not getting standardised brakes.
However, at least
effectively, Haas already are. You could argue they get the Ferrari setup. So I know we've spoken about this before, but Haas's problem is that they don't design all of their cars. They're always on a sort of a back foot, because they have to work out how what they've got works before then applying it to try see what they need to change. So they really have been in a difficult position, and it doesn't sound like they're making any changes to the way that they go about racing in terms of the listed parts. Obviously, there's aspects of that which change next season, and there's aspects of that will change again for 2021. So, partly their model will change by regulation, but not because they want to personally design more of the car, understand more of the car from their own engineers. So, I think they will continue to have good and bad seasons, depending if everything works the way it should do.
Yeah, going back to what you said about, or what I briefly touched on before about Renault as well. There's a team that should really be doing better than they are.
Yeah.
They're a works team, and if you remember, they said that they were going to aim for, was it wins in 2018? No, podiums in 2018, wins in 2019, and a championship contender for 2020. I think it was.
I think so.
And now, like, Renault's future in the sport's looking kind of uncertain. I mean, if they thinking of pulling the plug on the team, and if they do, we're going to see like a huge like a mushroom cloud, like erupt over Enstone, because like people are going to explode if Renault pull out of
what is it with the
Formula
explosions with this podcast?
we're just pyromaniacs.
The end of the world is not nigh. Yeah, Renault have had a pretty awful season. They had been making progress, which makes it all the more odd that they're really struggling this year. And it does seem to be much more the car itself and how it works between fast and slow corners than it does simply because of the tyres, like you would have with Haas. The Renault powertrain, I mean, we've seen McLaren obviously are now showing, this is not something we would have said a couple of years ago, the McLaren is showing that the powertrain that it's running is actually quite good, and it's got a good chassis as well. So suddenly McLaren are shading Renault, which is not something I think any of us would have predicted pre-season, because Renault were very much on the up and McLaren were really kind of struggling. So we know the powertrain is okay. It's not the best out there, but it trails probably Honda now very slightly. But we're talking about very small margins. It's not the complete disaster of an engine that it has been for the past few years. Still, the reliability isn't fantastic with the Renault, but I think they've had a much better year with the power unit than they have previously, which just serves to highlight the issues that the team have with the chassis and getting that working. And again, there's no lack of expertise at Enstone. It's you just got to sort these people out and get them working in the best possible way. So again, it has to go back up to the management. And the confirmation that Pat Fry's joining there is quite interesting.
It is, yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad thing. Now, no disrespect to Pat, he's clearly is a very good engineer, huge amount of experience. He tried to make his mark at various teams, and I just don't think that's what Renault are looking for right now. I mean, he's a very steady pair of hands, and should steer them in a good direction. But I think Renault needs something a bit more fundamental than just another head there in between all the other people that are running that team. So I think there's something else, at the top level of management there that needs sorting out rather than just throwing more heads at the problem.
I mean, of course, the main issue for Renault recently was the brake bias, accused of circuit mapping. And was it Grosjean that came out and said, "Oh, I had it in the car when it was a Lotus 4 years ago"?
This is there's been lots of misreporting about this. A lot of people jumping on the bandwagon and kind of finger pointing before any of the facts were truly known. And I think what they have is actually a very simple system, and it's not distance based at all. It's not GPS based. It's not active, reactive, or anything clever like that. I think they just basically set up a list of preset brake biases, which you flick through as you go around the lap. And, rather than it being plus 5% forwards, plus 5% forwards again, it's plus 3.4 to get to what that corner would need, which you probably add as a memory either by the driver on some of the outlaps, or potentially it could be programmed before the car runs. But I think that would be probably a bit contentious. So it probably is something that needs to be put in by the driver. And it just toggles through a set of brake bias settings which suit what the simulation suggests is needed for that lap. It looks like it's been on the car for a while. Judging from Grosjean's comments, it went on the car probably around 2014 when we had the change to the new power units, and you could then have brake by wire for the rear. So it's a fairly simple system. It's really not doing anything very clever other than just saving the driver pushing a button before he reaches a different sequence of corners. That said, the FIA feel it's a bit of a driver aid, I can support that. I mean, I don't think it's anything that's terribly bad, or probably even something that gives you a massive amount of performance. So a lot of shouting from Racing Point about getting this banned, and it's been dealt with by the FIA, and it's a kind of a closed book, really. It wasn't the sensation that it was starting to be when Racing Point was saying, "Oh, they've got this incredible system on their car." I don't think it was, some kind of magic bullet. Clearly the car's performance shows that it wasn't a complete magic bullet, but I don't think it was, a particularly important system on the car. But we've got the clarification now, and everyone can move on.
Yeah.
And we found that Racing Point are the first to complain about something that they don't like on another car that may or may not be illegal. all the fuss over the Haas flaw.
Exactly.
I remember you trying to explain it to us, and you need a degree in geometry just to be able to understand it.
It's something that you have to see visually. It's not something that you can kind of put in words and explain the shape of things. I mean, it's this time of year that when everyone has kind of kept their powder dry and thinking, "Oh, when's a good time to kind of really wind up one of our rivals?" And often this is just really just to unsettle another team rather than to actually make any obvious performance difference between the cars. At this point in the season, if so, there was other races when I think Renault scored better, where Racing Point could have protested then and got a bigger points haul than they did for was it Monza? I seem to remember, was it, or was it Mexico? I can't remember now.
It was in Monza, wasn't it, where the floor was?
It was Monza, wasn't it? Yeah. So so I mean, these sort of shenanigans go on all the time, and I'm sure Red Bull's protest about Ferrari and lots of the other chat about Ferrari isn't necessarily based on fact, other than just kind of wind your rival up when they need to be concentrating on other things.
But do you think maybe Racing Point was hoping that it was a bit of a magic bullet with them not being where they wanted to be, and if it could have affected Renault at all, it might have sent them back their way a bit more?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's there to try and eke a little advantage, for your own personal advantage out. I mean, if Renault and Racing Point were nowhere near each other, it probably would never have come up, because engineers go from team to team, and the first thing when an engineer goes to another team is they get debriefed as to, so what have you guys been up to then before you go and start your normal job? This isn't anything new that doesn't happen in Formula One and in other forms of motorsport all the time.
Yeah.
So it is just a little bit of a bit of winding up, a little bit of trying to eke a performance, and equally, it's like, well, if we can get that system banned, then that's money we don't have to spend to try and develop a system that's the same as that. So it's just all little tricks that teams are always playing with each other.
Yeah, I was going to say another team that's sort of fallen a little bit away as the season's gone on. Alfa Romeo, very similar to Ferrari in their philosophy of aero at the beginning of the beginning of the season. But then there was always that worry that maybe that was not the right path to go down, and maybe both teams might have boxed themselves in to sort of corner themselves with aero development. Ferrari appeared to have skirted around that and done, as we've already discussed, done okay. But Alfa haven't. They've sort of fallen backwards a little bit. Is that because their aero development's just not been up there with Ferrari's, or is it just the natural way of everybody around them improving?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's Alfa Romeo running out of steam a little bit, because we saw them at the start of the season throw quite a lot of new bits at the car. I'll talk about the sort of the aero philosophy and whether that wasn't the right idea at the moment, but I think it's much more about them being able to throw time and money at the car and develop new parts. Because we haven't seen anything particularly sensational on the Sauber, Alfa Romeo, sorry, as you call it.
It's all right, we know who you mean, it's fine. We keep calling Racing Point Force India.
I think sometimes you're not even aware what name you're using when you're talking, are we?
As long as you don't call Mercedes Tyrrell.
I'm sure they would love that, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it is just them not having their development curve flattening out because of budget or other resource issues at the factory rather than it being a philosophy led thing. I was speaking to various aero guys at a conference a week ago, and they were all saying, "Oh, it's quite interesting because at the beginning of the year there was this Ferrari versus Mercedes Red Bull concept with the front wing and how that feeds back to the barge boards and how it works with the front tire outwash." And I felt that the Ferrari solution with the what they call the inboard loaded, so the wings working on the inside and the outside is used for flow control. I thought that felt like a better solution. And then you had obviously Mercedes and Red Bull and a few other teams with what they would describe as the outboard loaded. So it's the wing profile near the wingtip that's doing all the downforce creation, which does that slightly to the detriment of the creating outwash to control the front tire turbulence, but does allow the barge boards to work slightly better. And from what we've really seen, everyone has moved more towards the Ferrari concept than they've moved towards the Mercedes concept. So if you look at what Mercedes have been doing, to an extent Red Bull, both of them have been going to a much flatter area of wing by the wingtip rather than having the that area being used for downforce creation. So I think that is one of the things where I think everyone will kind of equalize a little bit over the winter as they play with the concepts on the car, and you'll end up with something maybe not as extreme as the Ferrari and the Alfa Romeo solution, but something much more like that than what we saw with Mercedes and Red Bull at the start of the season. So I think maybe that concept has won out slightly as the year goes by. But again, I think between the two solutions, it's horses for courses. If you get one to work really well and you can get some potential out of that, then, there's no reason necessarily to change. It's just a case of, you've only got so much air. What are you going to do with it? But I think all of the teams have worked this year to make their cars slightly more efficient. And we're seeing a lot less of the really aggressive, dirty airflow solutions on the cars that it was starting to look like early in the season, particularly with the Mercedes. Maybe if Mercedes had really pushed the development of that car much harder, we would have seen much more interesting bits appear on it along those lines. But I think everyone's kind of just equalizing on that sort of concept idea at the moment, and I don't think we'll see huge differences for 2020 in that respect.
What about the did you see the overlay of the flexible Mercedes front wing in Austin, where it was under braking? It looked like the wing was flexing forward. Is that just a little bit camera trickery, or is there just a little bit too much flex going on in that front wing?
It depends whether you're asking my opinion or if you're asking what the regulations say.
A bit of both.
So the way the regulations work is the wing has various flex tests performed on it, both to stop it bowing downwards, which is what we saw particularly with that Mercedes wing, which really caught my eye.
Yeah.
And also they pulled down the rear edge of the flap, which is when you see the wing flatten off at speed. So rather than it being having a high angle of attack, it gets much flatter. Now, Mercedes, we had a lovely clear view of that in Austin, which was fantastic. But if you look at the onboard shots from most teams, you will see the wing flaps flatten at speed. And that's because the load that's applied to that flap is much higher than the test that they applied to it. And there's no other means in the regulations to kind of prevent that bending, which is what we used to have with the rear wing, but they've really kind of got the regulations there much better worked out, although some teams do show evidence of flexing on the rear wings, but it's not as much as it used to. So within the wording of the regulations, what we're seeing is legal because the wing meets the test. In inverted commas, it meets the test, but it doesn't meet what you might describe as the spirit of the regulation. So it's a bit like Lance Armstrong. He always passed the tests. It doesn't mean it's not kind of cheating.
Takes balls to do that.
I think the FIA should need to be much tougher with this because we can't be naive about this. The teams are designing this flex in. This isn't, everything has to be flexible. Nothing can be infinitely stiff. That's That's a true fact. But the fact of the matter is the teams will design these wings on the aerodynamics and then with the finite element analysis to see how that wing flexes under load to get an aerodynamic benefit. So there's no question this makes the car go quicker around a lap.
Yeah.
But everybody does it. The FI know about it. We have the tests. So it's kind of legal. But in my mind, that shouldn't be the case. It's like, well, if we're going to have flexible bodywork, let's have it. If we say that it's not, then let's put other regulations in place, like we've done with the rear wing, to stop this flexibility. Because, well, otherwise, why have regulations in the first place? You know, it's not innovation to try and work around a rule on flexible aero. I mean, that's not real innovation. I'd rather see much more interesting solutions being fitted to the car. It's really, you know, loopholes in the rules or cheating or, you know, just, you know, pushing the rules boundaries, which I don't really think is particularly useful or interesting. But this, as I say, this isn't limited just to Mercedes. The Mercedes one was just captured very clearly with the you know, the variation in downforce between the high-speed straight and the slow corners at Austin.
Yeah, geeky question then. What kind of load are those wings actually under when they're going at full jet?
All right. I can't remember the figure offhand, but if you work it out that at about probably a bit under 100 miles an hour, the whole car is producing its own weight in downforce. So that's what, 700 kilos.
Yeah.
The front wing produces about a third of the car's downforce. So that is what, 200 kilos, shall we say, as a rough figure?
Yeah, just over.
You got two sides of the front wing. So that front wing at 100 miles an hour, which is probably the slowest corner that you'll get in Austin, is about 100 kilos. Downforce doubles with speed. So on the straight, it's maybe getting 200 kilos. The test is 60 kilos.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's not even a close amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the teams will go, oh, you couldn't put any more force to test our wings because they'll just break under the load. And it's like,
oh, come on.
No, they really won't, will they? You could get the biggest mechanic to stand on the wing and it will not break. So
don't know, Grosjean seem pretty fragile.
Yeah, I mean that does depend quite how you drive them into other cars and characters. But certainly in terms of adding weight to the wingtip or to the rear edge of the flaps, you could go a much higher test load than is currently being applied. So, even with that simple maths, it's pretty straightforward to see that, you can make carbon fiber really stiff up to a certain point, which is what we saw with Red Bull and, lots of other teams earlier in this, sort of during the 2000s. And then just as you go past that loading, you can make the wings suddenly become very, very flexible. And it's all scientific. It isn't sort of any kind of sort of black magic or weird science or anything. It's all something you can actually sit down on a computer and predict. And this is what the teams do, and they try and make the most of what they've got within the regulations and within the tests and the way that the FIA apply this. Because this won't come, looking at those images, it won't come as a surprise to the FIA that is happening. They just choose to say, well, we've got a test, we'll just leave it there and we'll consider it legal, which, as I say, in my opinion, is wrong.
I think I agree.
No, I'm with you on that. We need Formula Scarbs.
Yeah, I've not been called up to be a scrutineer yet. I think there's far more qualified people than myself.
Because by the sign of it, you'll jump on people's front wings.
Yeah.
Well, it is. Yes, I might have to put a bit of weight on as well, though. If I was to start doing that, I don't think I applied quite enough. Maybe I could bring a guest with me to do the standing on the wings element.
I'll come as ballast.
Exactly. There we go. That's the new test.
Yeah. What's your official job title, Lee? I stand on wings in Formula One. Well, we actually.
Stand wings, yes.
I'd have to get Ron Dennis to think me up a job title.
Yeah, you would. Yeah. Yeah, we actually we still refer to the step, the step that the drivers now use to get into the car. We actually start referring to that as the Scarbs step because you explained to us about not standing on the floor when they get into the car. So because that was it this year they started doing that, or last year?
I think it was last year
With the halo.
It
Yeah.
was it was last year because of the change to the barge board regulations that they started to get really silly with it again, and all the teams were designing their own steps, which I just thought was the most ridiculous piece of F1 tech ever. But obviously wanted a bit of investigation and some photography, which is quite fun.
Imagine that. Imagine running up to the likes of Christian Horner, or as it was at the time, Maurizio Rivabene. You go, Maurizio, I've designed a box for people to stand on.
No, I still think far and away the daftest piece of F1 tech designed was the square of carbon fibre that you saw at the start of the first episode of the Amazon series, Grand Prix Driver, in one of the boardrooms in the McLaren Technology Centre, where it was put between two chairs, every two chairs, to make sure that each chair was the same space apart. It was a square of carbon fibre with a handle and the McLaren logo on it.
And it was a chair spacer.
It was a chair spacer for the boardroom.
I must have fast forwarded through that aspect of it. But that is very McLaren though, isn't it? It's that's the level of detail they love to go to. Someone pointed out, did you see the pictures of the Mercedes all being lined up, all of their 6 championship cars in front of the factory at Brackley? And someone pointed out that the driveway has got moss on it and has never been jet washed. And it's like, well, you just know that is Brackley and it's not McLaren's technical center, isn't it?
Lee, did you want to share with Scarbs now the story about what happened with the notepad when you went to McLaren at the desk?
I can't remember.
Was it when the woman tore the corner off the?
Oh yeah, when she was giving us our little passes with our names on it, she tore my pass off, and she tore half the thing off it there. And I said, "Don't you get sacked for things like that around here?"
I was just very disappointed.
Not since Ron left.
No.
I was just very disappointed to find out in the MTC they actually use bog standard Bic biros.
Only for you guys.
Yeah, I think things have probably moved on since Ron Dennis's reign has ended at MTC. But yeah, there's lots and lots of really great anecdotes from that place about how they used to manage the smallest details of things, but maybe they're a bit more pragmatic nowadays.
I heard the story about the soap dispensers. That there was a dripping one in one of the gents' toilets, so Ron Dennis made the engineers redesign all of them.
And we didn't see any flying monkeys that were off to get Ferrari data.
Well,
you don't flying monkeys. You just need to have a meeting in a restaurant over a Grand Prix weekend. It's just always needed.
Yeah, we're never going to get invited back, are
No.
we?
And maybe in maybe in Alonso, Gate seemed to follow him.
Oh, please tell me there is a gate at the MTC named after Fernando Alonso.
On the subject of that, it's actually quite interesting that they want the driver budget cap included, didn't they? At McLaren, Jack Brown was saying, "Oh, the driver's salary should be part of the budget cap."
Yeah, because
from
the top 3.
From that, I assume that he hasn't got Alonso on his books anymore, has he?
No, definitely not.
No, drivers aren't included in the top 3 highest paid employees in the organisation. Don't come under the budget cap as well.
Yeah,
I imagine it does as well, because it's about 300 grand, isn't it? Lando Norris has turned out to be a bargain this year.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Talking to McLaren, what do you think about the IndyCar entry for next season, teaming up with Arrow Schmidt-Peterson?
It's not really my area of expertise. I know a lot of people that I know that are into IndyCar racing kind of raised a slight eyebrow about this. I'm not entirely sure why. But it's certainly from the way they operated their team for last year, it seems that it's at least a better bet to start that direction. So hopefully they'll have some sort of better results and have a slightly stronger season. What I was confused about is why they put a camouflage livery on an Indy car. what were they camouflaging? We all know what the car looks like.
Yeah, that
You know,
standard car that they all use.
yeah, it's with the public domain. Why put camouflage on? I just didn't know it. It did remind me of a 1970s sofa, I have to tell you, that orange pattern. But yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting that McLaren have actually put in so much effort to maintain an Indy presence, and I think it's very much this kind of heritage thing that I think McLaren are now sort of trying to push. That they're racing on sort of both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that's a good thing. And fingers crossed for them that they'll have a better season.
I mean, is it a case of McLaren spreading themselves a little bit too thin because they're now backing the the Bahrain Merida cycling team even more as well? Because local interest in that, because Mark Cavendish has just signed for him, so he's been turning up at the MTC on his bike.
Yes.
And are they trying to sort of show that there's more to McLaren than hypercars in an F1 team these days?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a balancing act, isn't it? I mean, you see, race teams, and particularly when they have big sponsors or road car companies becoming involved with them, that suddenly they get involved with a little bit of everything, spread themselves very thin. And there's a few other sort of big names out there that could be accused of doing that right now. It really depends on budget, doesn't it? If someone is funding this, it is actually relatively easy to bring in the extra people from, America for the IndyCar team, to sub some of the people at the F1 team and then backfill again. So this can all be done as long as you don't start to go too mad. And you have to remember that you've got McLaren as the race team, but you've also got McLaren Applied Technologies. So you've got a big group of engineers sitting behind all of this that can be pulled in and out. And this is going to be quite interesting for the midfield teams because you have Williams and McLaren that are very big with this consulting arm attached to the team. Red Bull are now upscaling their consulting arm, Red Bull Technology, doing a lot more. So like the IndyCar Aero Screener is one of their projects, but they're involved in a lot more. And this will be a way for the teams to actually play about with the budget cap, because you've got to put your staff's salaries into the budget cap. But if you've got a guy that works probably only 6 months of the year on stress calculations or something when you're doing a new car, you got to if that guy is employed full time permanently, he's on your books 12 months a year, even if he's only got 6 months of work. If they can then be subbed out to your consulting arm, then that's 6 months of salary that doesn't appear on the F1 team's balance sheet. So this was always, whenever they started to talk about these budget caps, all of these teams started to talk about these, little arms where they can, and you'll find Mercedes probably do that with the road car arm. Ferrari, I think it's quite evidential that they have people that they pull in and out of various aspects of the Ferrari group to do bits of work here, there, and everywhere. So it's you can run these other projects, and sometimes other projects will actually help you look after your balance sheet with the budget cap.
And of course, if anyone on one of the other projects that isn't F1 related just happens to come up with something that the F1 side of the operation can use, then that's not going to be counted against their development costs. Call me a cynic, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean there is always that situation, and R&D budget is quite hard to quantify when you're getting into some of these groups and things. But I think I've not looked at the regulations in detail, but I think there could be some criticism of how the budget cap will be enforced, whether it's proactive or reactive, exactly what gets included, and how teams get imaginative with the bookkeeping, which we know is all possible and can often be seen as completely legal and above board, even in the normal world of commerce, not just racing car teams.
Is it not going to have loads to do with sponsorship as well? You're going to see loads more sponsors paying for more in teams, and therefore, more marketing being done by Formula One drivers, appearing on TV adverts or YouTube clips for marketing purposes, just so that there's more money coming in from sponsors as well as the salary cap and the budget cap that they're using.
Yeah, I mean that you're right. There is that aspect to it, but equally, increasingly with Formula One teams, is that you don't necessarily get sponsorship in the form of cash in your hand. You get technical partnerships. So, obviously the fuel companies are a big example, and we saw some huge figures being touted about on social media this week about how much engine development has cost since 2014. They're talking about figures in the over $1 billion.
Wow.
That is just what the manufacturers have put in. If you then think of what the fuel companies and all the other companies that have an interest in powertrain development have put in as well, the figure probably is even greater than that. So you'll probably find, teams getting more free brake calipers or dampers or, software, anything that can make it come off. And again, I don't entirely understand how the budgeting and the monitoring of this goes, but if you do have a sponsor that gives you free wheels, is that counted, or is that a figure that never appears in your balance sheet, therefore it never counts towards your budget cap? So I don't know the
things
answer.
like software as well. I mean, your analytics software. How can you put a price on that without actually having something to compare it to that would be a product to buy? If you know what I mean. But it's all very, it's a massive grey area, I think, which I think people are going to find many loopholes in.
Well, doesn't Ross Brawn have his loopholes team?
I still think that they're going to find
just specifically to find as many loopholes as possible because, well, they're learning from from the master.
I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be on the technical side or on the financial side, because the loopholes team on the financial side, I would imagine, have a far more difficult job than people working out gaps in bodywork regulations.
Send them over here. We've got enough creative accountants.
Yeah, there's probably a greater number of creative accountants than there are creative engineers waiting around to work for Formula One.
I suppose driver salaries as well. There must be things that could be snuck away if that's not included.
Well, exactly. It's I mean, I think it. I'm not quite sure if it works that way to today, but Marlboro have always paid for the Ferrari drivers' salaries. So does that appear? If the drivers were to be included, would that appear on the balance sheet, or wouldn't it? You suddenly have drivers with their own personal sponsors, and maybe they'll get more of that, and it gets siphoned off in other ways. So, I don't. It's not an area of the regs that I really know in detail, but I think we can hear people throwing probably some fairly quite wild accusations at each other as these regulations settle in. But as I say, for a lot of the teams, the budget cap is it's a dream figure to reach that. They won't reach that budget cap, unless they suddenly got a lot more money coming through the door. And I think that is short term is a bit of a drawback. But I think as they then bring that budget cap down, then maybe it will become a bit more of a level playing field, with the midfield teams and the big budgeted teams.
Here's one for you as well. The drivers. Sorry, Paul.
I was just going to say, when the budget cap was announced, somebody asked, "What is that in real terms?" And the only thing I could explain to him was three Williams or a Ferrari wheel nut.
Yes, it was probably something quite like that. Yeah.
No, but with the drivers, do you think you might find a bit of an opportunity for younger drivers coming through, and maybe more drivers in a team? So I was literally just thinking it then as you were speaking. Just like you might have 2 young drivers as the team's drivers, but the sponsors are actually providing the drivers who are in the cars on the race weekend. So. So there are 2 drivers in their budget cap. Well, we're not paying them, technically speaking. So it could. There's too many variables, I think, for it to be workable at the moment.
I hope it doesn't become a massive point of conversation through 2021,
like tyres have been this year. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know the details, but I think I think it would be terrible if, as someone pointed out on social media, I think it was during that. I've tried to say, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Formula Money. They said we could actually have the championship won at the last race but you may have to wait 2 or 3 months to have the championship decided while they go through the accounts. So it's like, oh, that
Yeah, you don't want that.
That really isn't a nice way of doing things, and it'd obviously be a terrible way for a team to lose a championship. But you know,
imagine that Lewis Hamilton wins his championship, and then in come the due diligence team.
Yeah, we'll send the accountants up to the podium.
Yes. So yeah, it could be tricky, but again, from what I've seen of the regulations, they've been very thoroughly thought out, and particularly on the technical side. So you would have to hope that the amount of rigor they have put into this really will pay off in 2021, and we get the start of a Formula One, which will carry us through sort of the next decade with some exciting racing and some pretty exciting looking cars. To be honest, I mean, I think they look quite cool.
I think I was going to ask actually, are you excited for 2021 with these regulations that you're seeing, Craig, or is it something that you just think might peter out a little bit?
I'm excited from a point of view that the regulations for probably the first time ever have been really properly thought through.
Yeah.
Now we had the overtaking working group working for sort of 2009 regulations, but that was literally just a very brief project that was then never followed up. What we've now got is a mechanism to decide the regulations based upon people actually working out the effects of a regulation change and then second guessing the effects of a regulation change. So, that's aspect of it I'm really excited about. That's the way things should always have been, but never have been. The cars themselves, I think they're going the right direction again. I think that's all working really well. There is the question: will the cars all look different than each other? Is there enough area for differentiation between the cars, areas for teams to really be able to put their effort in? And I must say, I've not read the regulations closely enough to really know that the cars will look a little bit different from each other because of the way they've reworded the regs. I think that works really well for us. Whether teams can have enough benefit with the aero, I think teams will always have an aerodynamic advantage one way or another without screwing up the aims of the regulations. So I think all of that is really good. Most people can't tell one F1 car apart, even with the color schemes, let alone if they were all painted white. So I don't think in terms of visual differentiation, I think the team should be working on making damn sight better liveries rather than bitching about they can't add any visual differentiation. Because let's face it, no team principal goes into the design office or into the aero department and says, I want a car that looks really different from everybody else's. I want a real big feature on the side of the car, because it just, the engineers just don't work that way.
No.
So, and everyone tends to start to follow the same design after a year or two anyway. We've seen that already this year. So, I think some of the criticisms about that will be kind of just people complaining before the event, which is we often get when you get regulation changes. Everyone always sort of will find something to moan about, which its actual impact after. It's kind of very much like the halo and with with the regulations again this year. Oh, the cars are going to look awful, and oh, this is terrible. And it's a very little consequence when it actually happens. So I don't think that would be a big issue.
And look at all those people that stopped watching Formula One when the halos went on. What fools!
Whatever happened to them?
Yeah, and it's the same people complaining now about the next big thing that were complaining about the last big thing and the big thing before that. So it's just, that's just the nature of people moaning on social media, I think, to be honest. So, yeah, I mean, I'm quite excited. Whether I'll have quite the same amount of work to do in seeing the big differences between the cars will be, a little bit debatable. But, I would accept that. Sort of slight lack of technical diversity and visual development for better racing, which is really what we're all interested in at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And some of these spec parts have been scaled back, or their introduction has been delayed. And again, I think that's something that the sport still needs, even under the budget cap. And I don't think it would be a detriment to the sport. And we'll just, see that these regulations, how they work and how Ross Brawn's team react to what the teams, do with the cars under these regulations, because that will be the real test for this process, not just the year one, but when someone comes out with something that everyone then slaps their forehead and goes, oh God, we didn't think about that. And, what will they do to circumvent, some of the clever thinking that the teams are bound to come up with?
Do you think it was a bit of a shame that the Saturday qualifying race was sort of scuppered as the experiments before it started?
I think my gut reaction was no. I don't think it was a problem at all. I don't think they should have had a qualifying race. It just doesn't feel. Formula One's never had qualifying races, which is not to say that it should never ever have them. But I think qualifying works quite well as a spectacle at the moment, and I don't think a qualifying race would necessarily add any great change to it, especially if we're going to get better racing on a Sunday with these new cars. So, I think that's something maybe they could put on ice for the future. They've talked about changing the weekend format, and again, I'm not against that. But then you do have the issue is that these we don't have hardly any testing, so people can't get to see the cars in between races. We don't have much pre-season testing. A lot of people turn up on the Friday because it's the best day to see the cars, because you get quite a few hours of running, and it's cheap to get in. If you're then going to lose Friday from a revised weekend package, then why are fans turning up? I mean, if you think about it, if they turn up on a Saturday, they get an hour of practice, and well, it depended on which team they or driver they're backing, they might not get less than a few minutes of qualifying.
Robert Kubica.
And the same. Yes, exactly. You'll get an hour on Saturday morning, and then
2 minutes.
A 15-minute session. Yeah. And the race lasts an hour and a half, so Sunday's not very good value. There's no Sunday morning warm up anymore. So if you cut away Friday as well, and not to be derogatory against F3 and F2, the support package at a Grand Prix is nothing like it used to be. You used to get into track action all day long, loads of entertainment on track. Nowadays, particularly at the flyaway races, you get some historics or some TCRs or maybe a Porsche Super Cup race, which isn't really entertaining the fans for a very expensive ticket for a day.
Local millionaires going past in a supercar.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but fan experience they call it or something, isn't it? And it's like, well, there's not many fans getting an experience there, is there?
No.
And it just that it strikes me as that we should be having the cars out on circuit more, not less. So I would rather see more practice sessions, maybe forcing Friday to be maybe the young driver program or something, and then getting a bit more of a longer session. Sunday warm up, I think, would be fantastic. I mean, I used to watch that. That was like the start of the day's viewing, before the days where you had like a 2-hour build-up show where, they talk about. I don't know what they talk about in a 2-hour build-up show, but
talk about
they don't seem to come.
Verstappen likes his toast.
I have massive problems with Sky's build-up for the Formula One. Like it's
how good are the drivers at darts and basketball? I mean, this is the question.
What's this all about?
Limited exposure we get to these drivers, we need to make the most of it. So I think darts is a critical factor.
I can quite honestly say I could have lived my whole life without seeing Natalie Pinkham and Anthony Davidson have a cup of coffee in Spain. I could have gone without that. I'd have been fine.
I wonder what Kimi Räikkönen's like when he races a child's toy. Well, okay, I'm intrigued, but I don't need to see it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's when the sport has got so much complexity to the sporting and the technical side, and so much going on. It would be nice to see more in-depth view of that than some of the superficial stuff that does go on. But I think above all, I'd much rather just see the cars on track.
I think. Sorry, Go on. Sorry, go on.
No, go on. Finish on.
No, I was going to say I think Sky could learn a lot from what Formula One are doing on the app now, because their coverage was just Will Buxton talking to drivers and talking about what the race is going to be.
What has happened and
It's
what's likely to happen.
Far more interesting than what Sky do for 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean it's strange. I'll come out on the side of the broadcasters for a moment. It is very hard to pitch how you do your coverage to your fans, because obviously you get a lot of very casual fans for Formula One, even with the pay-per-view format. So it's very hard for them to decide what to do. But that said, when you see the number of people with all of these broadcasters, I mean, yeah, we're not just talking about Sky. You talk about all the international broadcasters. How little some of them actually seem to do with anything other than the scheduled press conferences. You do wonder why do you send so many people to a race? But then you do see the people that do a really good job, and Will Buxton on the official Formula One is a great example. Is if you can just shove a microphone in front of someone because they're passing, you get really interesting stuff. And this is the sort of stuff that I've tended to do. And as you know, I work a lot with Peter Windsor, who spent decades doing this. And the little snippets you can get from someone just from a side comment is so much more interesting than for these big staged things, particularly when the teams will finally give, a broadcaster 3 minutes with a driver, as long as you've got prearranged questions that have been vetted by all the sponsors and all the PR people. And it just ends up being a very bland interview. Just snapping someone going, oh, you had a bit of a wobble during practice, and they'll go, oh yeah, why this happened, and what happened with your brakes in the race, and you're just getting some feedback. And I think that's one of the things that you get with sort of Ted's notebook that comes across very well with Sky, that doesn't come across in lots of their other coverage, just grabbing people in the moment and just getting a bit of information that otherwise doesn't tend to get recorded, and doesn't get covered by the screen.
I was going to say, do you remember during the 90s, I can remember watching Formula One, and it would just be reporters waiting by the team trucks for a driver to leave and trying to grab a word with them then. It was never this prearranged press pen or anything like that. It was just waiting for Gerhard Berger to leave the McLaren truck to find out why he crashed in the race
because he was drunk.
Because he was in there talking to Ron Dennis. He was actually having his debrief, and then he'd have to come out. But now they've got these actual press areas. It's just it's not clinical. It's because obviously you get a little bit more access to the drivers, but the access that you get is less personal. It's far more
less organic.
Yeah, less organic. It's far more.
It is, and
media training, etc. has to be done now. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is a couple of sides to that. I mean, if you ask every driver, so how was your race? You're going to get a very bland answer from them, and a lot of people probably don't even know some of the detail of the driver's strategy or the issues they've had in the race, because they've sat the whole race literally with headphones on outside the pen, waiting for people to come through in case there's a retirement. And I've done some work in the media pen for Chinese TV.
Yeah.
If you catch the driver with a slightly odd question or with a little bit of insight of something that's happened in their race, they respond so very differently to you, and they will actually then start to tell you some of the story of their race, rather than just, oh, for sure, it was very difficult, we really were hoping for something a bit better. But if you say, well, actually, Nico, that you was on the soft in that middle stint and it just didn't seem to happen for you, and then they'll come back and go, yeah, and then start to tell you about it as though they're giving you a debrief. There are ways of tackling these, and then some of the drivers will expect that from you, and some of the drivers will be attracted by other people in the pen asking blander questions if they really want to feel like they want to get an easy ride. So, I think fans do deserve slightly better TV coverage all over, to be honest. But then again, we're a bit spoiled. I mean, I watched an old race replay the other day. It was one of the ones, the BBC Grand Prix coverage from the 80s, which would be shown typically on a Monday night, highlights that would start after the opening credits had finished with the race start. Maybe if we were lucky, we would see who the grid order. It would go straight into the race start, and then all Murray Walker and James Hunt would have is the order of the cars. So all the commentary would literally be and so is now in fourth, and so is now in fifth, and so is now in sixth. And then someone's overtaken, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and then we'll just go back to giving you the order. And then 30 minutes later, the program finished with the car going over the finishing line, and that was it. That's all we got.
Still sounds better than the idea of
we are
James Allen.
Yeah, we are slightly spoiled now.
Well, even going back to sort of the 90s and stuff, you watch sort of races in the 90s, you realise just how good the actual coverage is of the races. It's just sometimes I think I understand Sky have the
well, they've got to pull in the other
new viewers and stuff like that.
People who are casual fans.
But sometimes I feel like I watch Sky and they feel like everybody that turns their telly on, this is the first race they've ever seen. And I think it goes far too much that way sometimes. For a sport that is essentially, it's a nerd sport. If you're into it, you're into it.
I mean, the great thing about Formula One is that you get a very broad variety of fans, from the very young to the very old. You're getting and all people across all different sort of genres, and then you get the people that are really deeply into it and the people that aren't deeply into it. And I think the coverage needs to reflect. I mean, imagine if you could get a half hour or an hourly week show just after the Grand Prix had finished on a Monday or a Tuesday that really did do all that deep technical stuff, and it just it's not being produced by people. And I found that really kind of disappointing, because it's not very expensive TV to do stuff like this. So I think there is still an opening there for that. But my fear is I think we're losing Channel 4 at the end of the season.
Yeah.
You're not encouraging people into the sport either.
We've got a camera here now.
Yeah. Do you think there's a
chance?
Yeah,
we'll send you guys over. That's quite straightforward, isn't
it? Do you think there's a chance with like Netflix doing the review thing every year now? Do you think there's a chance that once the Sky rights are up, you could see it go to a streaming service like Netflix?
I mean, I think it's a possibility. I mean, that's where the money seems to be at the moment. On the point of the Netflix, actually, we're kind of talking about maybe the nerdy side, but Formula One is just a whole heap of stories. Everyone in the paddock is interesting. Every race weekend is interesting, and the Netflix series really kind of caught that.
I thought it was brilliant.
At a range of levels, I mean, Gunther Steiner is clearly now, the world's biggest celebrity, and he's probably going to be, winning whole heaps of awards and stuff. But
we've renamed our heroes and villains prediction for each race. It's now rock stars and wankers.
Yes, but that's the stuff that should, the Netflix stuff is what should be being produced by F1 and by all of the other broadcasters. That's the level of stuff that we should be seeing. All of these stories. That's the interesting stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think the future for F1 in terms of broadcast, and I mean, I don't know much about which way they're going to go with the financial model, but somewhere along the line, someone's going to have to stump up a heap of cash. That has been the satellite broadcasters. Maybe it will be the streaming services. Maybe it will be something else. It can't be the circuits. We've seen it. That Bernie model is unsustainable. It can't be ticket prices. So we need to find ways of funding the sport to get it out there, and hopefully it's at a cost that's reasonable for fans to just come across the sport, because there's so much variety of sport on. I say on TV. It's not on TV anymore, is it? It's across every visual channel. Particularly with the internet now. So. If it's stuck on TV, if it's stuck on pay-per-view, you're not going to be encouraging people in. And, equally with the regulations, if you're not thinking about the next generation, then your sport becomes a heritage series and parks itself in a cul-de-sac very quickly. And it may, it will probably, it's got huge coverage, Formula One. It will take a long time for that to degrade to the point where it's, financially unviable. But if you don't look after it, that could happen. And, that is always a worry for people involved in the media of the sport, and obviously for the fans of the sport.
Yeah, need to make it viable for the circuits as well as the fans, because some of the traditional circuits, including the Brazilian one, which is coming up this weekend, appears to not going to be around much longer.
Well, exactly. And there were some worrying comments from Chase Carey today. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to have to delete some of the circuits that don't meet our brand image. And it's like, what does that mean? What circuits don't meet? Because
Like
Formula
Korea
One.
has gone.
Sounds a bit Bernie-ish, that, doesn't it? When we were talking about getting rid of Spa and Silverstone and things.
I don't think he said delete. I think he said terminate with extreme prejudice.
Well, exactly, and I think Formula One needs to have these new circuits, and that's all part of bringing in new markets, but it does also need to trade on its heritage as well.
Absolutely.
There's a balance there, and if we had nothing but new emerging economy races for 2025, God help us, races a year, I think Formula One will very soon lose its interest, because you need to have, and not especially all of them, but you need to have your Monacos, your Spas, your Monzas, French, Germany, British Grand Prix. But equally, they, some of these circuits, and sadly, I think Silverstone may be one of them that hasn't really kind of put the effort in for the fans that perhaps it needed to. And do they deserve to have a Grand Prix just because of heritage? It's difficult, but if it's down to the circuit to always be having to put the money in and still turn a profit from ticket sales, then it becomes difficult for them. So if they're paid to put an event on, a Grand Prix used to be, I remember going as a child in the 70s, and it was, an absolute circus of an event. Everything was going on. Now, admittedly, that was when you had lots of, tobacco money sponsoring all sorts of bits and pieces going on there. But, concerts, other races, other stuff going on track, off track. I mean, a Grand Prix needs to be a huge event. And, there's very few races that really put on something. I mean, you're really looking at places like, Singapore it becomes a big event, and it tends to be the city centre ones. The more I think about it now out loud, you think of Montreal, Melbourne, Austin. The circuits are all very closely tied to a capital and to a big event, and they are the best races to go to. As a fan, luckily in my situation as a journalist, they're the ones you really enjoy. When you're, miles out of town in the middle of nowhere and there's not much else going on, it's like, well, it's just a race.
Korea.
It's like,
I was going to say, that's taking us back to Korea again.
I never did Korea, so I'll have to skip judgment on it. But with the Chinese Grand Prix, I mean, the circuit is a long way from anywhere, and it's a really, really long way from the really quite exciting and vibrant centre of Shanghai. And there's not much else going on trackside, and there's lots of other races that are a bit like that as well. I'm not just picking on China, or even far-flung races. Some of the European races are very much the same. So I think the whole sport, and this is what I'm a little bit disappointed with Liberty, that whole kind of holistic view of what a Grand Prix should be, how we're going to fund all of this. I don't think they've really nailed that yet, and I'm worried that time's moving on, and they haven't really kind of changed the model that much.
Yeah, we're still waiting for these 20 Super Bowls a year that they were promising.
Yeah.
Well, they did knock on the head the commentator at the start of the American Grand Prix that they tried a few years ago. So they've learned from at least a couple of mistakes.
What I worry about is with bringing the new races and stuff in, is that we end up with a calendar of half street races.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could all equally turn up with a whole load of Tilke circuits, which everyone seems to go to the same people. So, I mean, I think there needs to be more variety in the circuit. So, back in the day, and I put my old man hat on now, and it's like you would have some super fast tracks. Paul Ricard, Silverstone used to be like one of the super fast, as well as like Monza before the chicanes. No one seems to be going out of their way to build super fast tracks. You've then got tracks that had big hills and tracks that were very tight, and then you had street circuits, and then you had street circuits in odd places like Las Vegas car parks, and ones with interesting backdrops, and then you had Dallas, which was they tried to make it a very fast street circuit. There was a lot of variety, but everything now tends to be very medium. Everything's a kind of a medium speed corners, a couple of longish straights to give a bit of interest, and that's just kind of it. There's just not a lot of interest with these tracks. And even if you think back as recently as somewhere like Turkey, which was a fantastic track, really challenged the cars. When you see all these new circuits, where are these really challenging corners that, have legends built up around them? The sort of the Tarzans of Zandvoort and, Eau Rouge and, corners like that. There's very few places where the cars are really stressed out on some circuits. And I think we need to see a bit more of that
Cars
big
and
feature.
Drivers as
Yeah,
well.
it's both of them. I mean, I don't give a monkeys about most of the drivers, but it's, if the cars are stressed, then at least it'll give the drivers something to concentrate on while they're busy talking to their race engineers. So yeah.
Well, in case of Lando Norris, singing to your race engineer.
Yeah, no, we don't want to encourage that. No. Definitely not.
Well, talking of circuits that are kind of traditional, we do have the Brazilian Grand Prix this weekend. I think it's probably an idea to take a look at that.
Yes, probably.
First race in a long time that Toto Wolff isn't going to, which is odd.
Well, I suppose he's got nothing to sort of be dependent upon. I mean, it's all kind of downhill from here now for Mercedes to the end of the year, and this is, oddly, it's been a feature for quite a few years. It's going to be an interesting weekend, isn't it? I mean, the circuit, it's a real split of the back section and the long straights. You've got the altitude, which really gives the chassis a workout. So it should be one that really stabilizes the competitiveness between Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes. I don't think there's anyone that really jumps out as an obvious favourite, other than really knowing what the weather's going to be like, because obviously it can be quite cold, it can be very, very hot.
Changeable.
We can get the rain, which changes, the effect of the tyres. Obviously, if we get rain in quali or the race, everything, suddenly comes up for grabs. So I think it would be actually a slightly more interesting race if we did have some rain during the race, to see some of the midfield teams, work their strategy. Some of these young drivers and some of the midfield experienced drivers pull a result out of the bag that, embarrasses the top teams. I think that would be where the excitement would really be. But it'd be very hard otherwise on a completely normal weekend with reasonable temperatures to say who'd come out on top. I think Bottas is clearly on a bit of a roll at the moment. Historically, Hamilton, has I don't want to call it a lull, because that's a bit insulting to him, but he doesn't always perform at his best after he's won the championship. For those last sort of few races, we've often seen the other driver have a much more success at the last couple of races of the year than they have when Hamilton's kind of on full song mid-season, gunning for the championship. So that's could be a slightly interesting thing. I think the needle at Ferrari is quite interesting at the moment as well, isn't it? Between the two drivers on any given day. Each of them can be quite magnanimous when they're either beating or have been soundly beaten between each other. And equally, I think Albon in the Red Bull is starting to get his act together a little bit, isn't he? I think the final result in Austin maybe isn't quite what he wanted, being behind, I think, a Renault and McLaren, if I remember off the top of my head.
That drive was great, though. He had such a good drive.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're seeing up and down the grid, and I think the TV's been relatively good this year and showing lots of the midfield action. And some of the sort of the ding dongs that are going around there, because it's continuing to be a very tight midfield, and we've got some of the drivers there now that really are starting to sort of show their colours, and you're seeing. I think Norris really has kind of made a mark for himself. Albon, I think, the Toro drivers as well. Now they've had a little shuffle around of drivers. It's the midfield is really quite interesting, and as I say, the wet weather this weekend, I think, really would bring that lot really to the front of the cameras, which should make for a cracking race, because I don't think Abu Dhabi is the final race is really going to deliver us a huge amount of excitement. So we're really kind of relying on Brazil to really have the fireworks.
Got to be looking at the Verstappen's revenge, haven't you? Really, from after what happened to him last year, and he usually performs.
About that last year.
He usually performs pretty well. But did he do a bit of a Vettel Vettel in Canada this year? He rammed into the sign that said he was second after when he pulled into the paddock, didn't he, into Parc Fermé there. I think he was fairly upset when he got out of the car. That's when the whole Ocon incident happened.
Yeah,
wasn't
Ocon
it?
drove into him, lapping him.
Yeah, unlapping himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, I mean, the first lap could be really interesting as well, especially if we have a slightly damp start. Imagine that, everyone going through that first sequence of bends and then down to that. You have then have the long downhill straight, don't you, into that quite tight turn.
yeah, what you want
Imagine the mess they would make of each other.
yeah, what you want to
With
happen
everyone
is
charging off the wet bridge.
dry as they set off, and then it starts raining on the formation lap.
It looks like it's going to be sort of changeable weather conditions on Sunday between damp and bright.
That's
So
Brazil.
we might get it.
Damp and bright,
Well, we
or
can get it.
really wet.
Just damp.
Oh,
Less than a
No,
centimetre
I think
of rain.
yeah, I think when it comes wet, it becomes too much of a lottery. But I think flitting between damp and almost dry enough to be on slicks, I think that's when the driver skill and the team tactics really pay off, isn't it?
yeah,
Once it's fully wet, they can't race. And I mean, it's, you can be thrown off the circuit through absolutely no fault of your own. I don't think that's driver skill. That's just luck. So,
yeah.
yeah, we want intermediates, certainly not wets going out there. And yeah, I think rain on the outlap, on the parade lap, yeah, that would do me. That would,
Yeah.
that would that would fit the script really nicely, just to kind of round the year off with a real whiz bang of a race.
It would do.
We've only had one wet race.
At Brazil.
No, this year.
This season, Germany.
Yeah, just the one wet race. It's rained like 10 minutes after the race a load of times.
Yeah, we've not really had. Yeah, I don't even. I can't even remember the German race, which is really strange.
The one where Mercedes forgot how to do pit stops.
Ah, yes. So it's completely got up. I'm not great remembering the specifics of races. I could tell you what wings they were running and bits like that, but I really can't remember.
You should have said
some of the
Paul,
action on
the one where
but-
Kvyat got a podium.
I was watching the German Grand Prix on Sky Go, so imagine my confusion when the stream like messed up a little bit. Only for mere seconds, and everything was fine before this happened. And then when the stream came back, Stroll was leading a Grand Prix. Nothing more confusing has ever happened.
Yeah, that is a bit odd, but yeah, I mean, I think if you got to put a name, I think certainly Verstappen would be a nice gamble to go for the weekend, other than the kind of the almost foregone conclusion of a Mercedes driver.
Yeah.
I think a good couple of quid would be on Albon as well, doing something crazy special.
Yep.
I think a good bet. Well, yeah, Albon for a podium. I think you probably get some nice odds for that, and I think there's a good chance of that one paying off.
Should we do some predictions for top three?
Wild money, and a non top three car on the podium, I think, would probably be the real killer bet. But the chances are.
If you're going to bet on somebody, it'd be Sainz.
Well, if it's changeable, you'd say probably Lando, because I know he didn't really get a chance to show what he could do in the damp, wet conditions in Germany. But don't forget when he did that Daytona 24-hour race with Zach Brown's team. He was when it was wet for that 2-hour period, he was a second a lap faster than the race leaders in a car that he'd barely driven before.
I mean, yeah, there's so much talent out there in the midfield at the moment. It's as you say, between Sainz and Norris, you got a bit more experience. And on Sainz on his day, when he puts his head down, he's producing fantastic racing, and we know that Norris is, has got the potential there. I think we just need to see that kind of brought out in a race. You think of the two Renault drivers in a wet race. Hulkenberg and Ricardo could be on the podium if they got their act together. And Perez always pulls together a fantastic race as well. In mixed conditions and when the tyres need to be used a certain way. So there's lots of scope out there for some cracking racing.
Lando just needs to shake off that Johnny Herbert look he seems to have acquired.
It was on for pole position until the seagull flew into his airbox.
You get when you can see potential in drivers, it's really frustrating sometimes, isn't it? When you just want them to be able to kind of pull out that result that you just think is in there. And I think this year we've been a bit frustrated, particularly with Leclerc, who hasn't really kind of pulled out some of the performances we thought that he really was capable of. The moment, I think maybe a lot of people, maybe the jury's out, but then you get weekends when Vettel's on song and everyone who's been lambasting all year for making stupid mistakes just puts in a great performance. It's like, oh God.
I've said all year that we were comparing Leclerc and like Lord and Leclerc against a wounded Vettel. It wasn't a real comparison to what Sebastian Vettel's been in the past. So I'm still like, since Vettel seems to have come back a bit, Leclerc seems to have dropped off.
Yeah, with a bit of performance.
It's very interesting, and you can only just imagine the pressures at Ferrari, particularly in a year where everyone feels you've kind of thrown it away, both from a team and a driver perspective. The pressure on those two guys must be immense, and then just weekend after weekend, seeing Mercedes just kind of just beat them in the second half of the race. It's like, oh, for God's sake, what's going on?
Yeah.
Why don't I just put this performance in and just get it done, on a regular basis? It's really difficult. But I suppose in some respects we talk about that, but that does show the consistency, particularly of Hamilton this year. I think that is really what's won him the championship, isn't it? That he comes out and he performs on a very even level every weekend. I know that maybe has a couple of races a year where he's not quite on song, but every other race you don't see him binning it, you don't see him screwing things up, and everyone else, every other 5 drivers in those top 3 teams you see do that, and that lack of consistency. So it can be done, and Hamilton's proved it this year, and he's won the championship early as a result of that.
He's still not finished outside the points this year, has he?
No,
don't think so.
I think he's finished every race. So yeah, I mean, he had one dreadfully bad race, and I'm trying to remember what the situation was.
Germany, and he ended up in the points because of a penalty.
Yeah.
No, I think he finished 9th.
Was it 9th?
Yeah.
I thought I can seem to remember a more recent dry race where he was about 8th or 9th. Was it Austria?
Yeah, possibly.
Was it Austria? Yeah, it was in the heat of Austria, wasn't it? Which maybe obviously wasn't his issue. It was the cooling on the Mercedes. But you do get other weekends where he's just not quite on the pace. But yeah, by and large, he works every set of tyres really reliably, which is one of his real race day skills. And he's kind of always there or thereabouts. And I think these other drivers have had such up and down seasons. You can see why championships are so easily lost, and seasons get lost like Ferrari have had this year.
I was thinking about this today, like Hamilton's consistency, and the only other person I could think about when it comes to that was Schumacher. I thought, but it's even more impressive how Hamilton's doing it, because like Schumacher would turn up to races in the best car, knowing that his teammate wasn't allowed to beat him, let alone capable of beating him. Whereas Hamilton knows that if Bottas is capable of beating him on that day, he will be allowed to do it.
Yeah, I agree to an extent. I mean, I think Bottas has got his wingman badges out quite a few times this year at the points when we really didn't think that was necessary. And I think Hamilton's mindset at the moment is knowing that he can beat Bottas on the majority of weekends, and I think that's really what gives Hamilton his strength. It's his self-confidence. Because he does lack that self-confidence sometimes. You hear it on the radio, and he just needs everything to be the right way for him. But as you say, when Bottas does get it hooked up, he can have a fantastic weekend and can be unbeatable. And clearly the Mercedes hasn't been the dominant car this year. So again, it all goes to show how the driver and the team effort in terms of race strategy and working the bigger picture out brings championships. And that's really the maturity we've seen in both Hamilton and the Mercedes team this year, because last year we often saw them with a more dominant car throw away race wins through bad strategy, and this year we've not seen that quite so much. The team's been much more consistent, much more on it strategically, and working with Hamilton with the tyres to get that win in, when actually most of us were calculating that it was going to be a disaster for them. But they know what they've got, and it works for them more often than not at the weekends. And another double championship win for Mercedes, which is really depressing from a Ferrari and Red Bull point of view.
Very much so. Right, let's do some top threes. I've got Dan's and Sean's here.
What did Dan go
They
for?
sent theirs in earlier. Dan has gone for a Verstappen win, Bottas second, and Hamilton third.
Okay.
Sean has slightly different, a Verstappen win, Bottas second, Leclerc third. And let me just find the guest prediction that we got sent in, because we have a guest predictor every week. And this is the F1 debate show. You can find them on YouTube. And they've gone for a Verstappen win, Hamilton second, Bottas third. Now it's our turn. And,
Right.
Craig, we're including you in this one.
Okay, well, you guys can go first.
It's hard to argue, isn't it, with a Verstappen win, to be perfectly honest. I mean, he was performing so well last year. He did well there the year before. And in the wet in 2016, I think it was, that great drive where he drove around the outside of Rosberg.
The save.
Yeah, and that save. Yeah.
I can argue with it because I need to make points up.
So I think a Verstappen win for me. I will say a Hamilton second, Verstappen win, Hamilton second, and Albon third. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility at all.
I'm going to go a Hamilton win,
Yeah.
Albon second, and Verstappen third.
Okay.
Right, okay. I am going for a Verstappen win. And my autocorrect on my phone has decided that I'm going for a Bernard win. I don't know who Bernard is.
Verstappen autocorrects to Bernard.
Bernard was the one that used to win every race.
Eric Bernard.
Let me think. I think, don't count Ferrari out in this. I'm going to go for Vettel second and Hamilton third. Right. One more to go.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I think odds on money. Let's go with a Verstappen win. I think if Verstappen wins, then that's because the Red Bull's been really good and the Mercedes hasn't. So I don't think we'd get a Merc in second. So I'd say probably Vettel second and then Bottas third.
Right. They are.
I don't know if someone has got that, but that's my punt for that.
Yeah. Right, they are entered in. I'll put those on the website, and the points are available for the weekend. We'll see how it goes.
Well, if it's changeable conditions, that goes out the window completely.
Completely. Don't forget, if you're listening and you want to take part in the predictions, go to 3Legs4Wheels.com, look on the game section, and look for 2019 Grand Prix Prediction League. Put in your top three. And you also get to put in your pole and fastest lap, and you've got till 5 minutes before Q1 starts on Saturday. I'll be doing the Q1 blog, the Q1, all three qualifying sessions blog.
You're just going to block Q1.
Well, I've got a gig Saturday night, so I've got to make a quick escape. So I might just leave everyone hanging after Q1's finished. I will do all of qualifying.
Fair enough.
And we'll be doing the live blog as usual Sunday evening for the race.
Yes, we
will. Sunday
will.
evening UK time.
Yes. Is there Brazilian food for blogging this time?
I don't know. We'll have to find some Brazilian recipes. We've done burgers and tacos the last two races, so I'm guessing we're going to have to. If anyone knows any Brazilian recipes, can you drop us a tweet at 3Legs4Wheels and tell us what the hell to cook?
It really is just barbecued red meat. I mean,
that literally is. Chicken hearts I had at a Brazilian restaurant
and some cocktails. I mean, that's my experience of being in Brazil. So it'd be a shame to go off piste on anything other than that.
I mean, the last Brazilian restaurant I went to, it was one of those where they just keep bringing you meat until
that's Brazil.
You ask them to stop. And I am not.
Yeah, I mean, that's it.
I am not getting 20 different kinds of meat in for this Saturday.
If you do, I might come and do this blog.
Your reaction when we walked into that restaurant in Birmingham was like, they won't do anything like that. Oh my God, they're just bringing me meat.
Yeah. I went to one of those, and that's where I got. What are these? These are pan-fried chicken hearts. Yeah, go on then. Why not?
Right, probably not got time for Total Shunt tonight because we are running late and we have kept Scarbs on quite a bit. Thank you very much for joining us, Craig. It is always a great show when you're on.
No, always good fun. Thank you very much, everyone. I really enjoy it. And yeah, we'll be able to catch up perhaps over the winter before the new season starts.
That would be fantastic.
It would be.
Yeah, if you're on YouTube, stick around. We'll be doing the usual Q&A. Craig, you're more than welcome to join us as well for the Q&A with the listeners. That we do about 10-15 minutes at the end of the show. If you want to get in touch, then tweet us at 3Legs4Wheels. We're on Facebook and Instagram at 3Legs4Wheels as well. And individually, we are...
I'm at a total shunt.
At Flood21.
At Pablo100. Dan is at Dan Dankleton. And Sean is at Sean Cowper. And of course, Craig, you are on Twitter.
At Scarbs Tech.
And right, that's about it. We will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dale.
And
we've stopped recording.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're just gonna fire up the because we've still got the video running for YouTube, Craig. So what we'll do is we'll just put you on the spot, really, because I'm sure they're going to ask you loads of questions. So we'll just load up the comments and just see what some people are saying. But no, thanks very much once again for joining us on the podcast. It's always great to hear your opinions on stuff when you're on, especially your technical insights as to sort of what's been because the development race, the race of development is always like sort of the undercurrent of the season, isn't it? The cars that develop better. And it's really interesting to have you on because you get to explain that and sort of how different teams, different cars have developed through the year.
Oh, hello.
Hello, you still hear us?
You still here? Can you hear us?
Are you guys still on? I lost you.
Oh no,
we still hear you.
There we go. Waited for us to finish before we had a poor connection.
There we go. I was just praising you. That's all.
No, I caught most of it. That's very kind of you to say so. It's the technical side is always a part of the sport, isn't it? I mean, it's unavoidable. Formula One without the cars is just kind of guys in tight suits running around, isn't it? So it gets a bit frustrating that not enough of the as we were talking about the media talking about the technical side of it, even in a very light touch way rather than some of the real seriously geeky stuff. Although I think some of that can be put across to people quite an interesting way as well. It's a bit frustrating that it has to be just purely talking about ex-drivers talking about current drivers on the TV, which I think there's only a finite amount you can have of that.
Yeah, no, there is absolutely. Yeah. So have we got the comments up on?
Got the comments up. Congratulations to Flood for succeeding tonight, where Paul has failed for the last 3 weeks.
Yep. Jeff gave me a word.
Oh no! What was the word?
Jeff gave me a word to say during the podcast,
and the word tonight was
mushroom.
Yeah, I've had 3 for the last 3 weeks and I've not managed to get them in.
Oh dear,
Yeah.
that's a failure on your part, Paul.
Oh, damn it. Do you guys think the points need to change to try to make a closer championship fight? No, not really. I think they've got the point system ideal at the minute.
Yeah, I quite like it as it is.
It's certainly better than, say, the NASCAR or IndyCar one, where it's the Oprah Winfrey point system. So you get a point, and you get a point, and everyone gets a point.
Yeah, like MotoGP.
I think that goes down to 15th.
Yeah, which is a bit silly.
I mean,
but they've got bigger grids though, haven't they?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if this point for fastest lap has really done anything to the spectacle of the sport at all. I mean, it just seems an utterly pointless thing to have added to the regulations.
I find it weird because they have to be in the top 10. At least it might have added a bit of spice if you were out of the top 10 and you could pit like a couple of laps for the end and then start trying to throw some like fastest laps.
Yeah, like K-Mag in that one race where he's got the lap record.
Like the Formula E Championship was decided on.
Oh,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
The first one that just turned into a fastest lap competition after they took each other out on the first corner.
Yeah.
But I mean, it seems to be a bit pointless if someone's going to come and pit for fresh tyres at the end of the race to get the fastest lap. It's like, what's that? Well, that means nothing, does it? It's like utterly. You got quality. You're better off getting points for qualifying, aren't you? It just doesn't seem to to add anything, and because the top three teams have always got at least half a minute on the rest of the field, someone at the back of them 6 cars is going to be able to pit and go for fastest lap.
Which is why Gasly managed it so many times, because when he was in the Red Bull, he was in the slowest of the top 6, but he always had a pit stop spare over whoever was in 7th.
Apart from a race, because I can't remember which race it was, but I had money on Hamilton to win and get the fastest lap, and he got the fastest lap on the last lap with tyres that had been on for what felt like he'd had tyres on for a decade, and he won me £150 with that lap.
Yeah, I don't think that's good enough reason for you winning money for us to keep that rule in the regulations.
I think it's an excellent reason.
Got a couple more comments coming in there, is there, Paul?
Yep, Guest5 says, are any of the 2021 changes going to affect F2 or F3? Do we not want the next generation of drivers to have a closer experience to F1? Rookies over the last few years have struggled to adapt, except for the 3 this year.
That's interesting, actually. I mean, we've just gone through the F3 cycle for a new car, so that's not going to happen very quickly. The F2 car is relatively new as well, so I think it will be a while before they wholesale change those cars again. You might see something like a body kit changing some of the bodywork in a couple of years, but I don't know. I mean, already that the F2 and the F3 cars have got quite big underbody diffusers, so they're not as sensitive to following in traffic as Formula One cars are. So they're already halfway down that road. So I don't think it's quite so critical, other than just keeping a visual similarity between the 3 formulas.
Yeah, I mean, I think F2, it's the second season of this car, because I don't remember the start of last year, nobody managed to get off the grid because everyone's clutch broke.
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
And F3, like you said, this has been the first season of the new car, because obviously the rules have merged now with
European
F3 and GP3 as was. But yeah, I mean, those cars can follow each other pretty closely anyway, so that's going to be closer to the Formula One experience, as you say, right from the off.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is actually Formula One going much more towards their aero than it is them going towards the new Formula One aero. So I think that kind of works in their favour. And let's face it, there is no lack of good racing. Sorry, although there has been some bad stuff in the lower categories. I mean, they always provide plenty of excitement during the races, more often than not.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's been some cracking F2 and F3 races these last couple of seasons. And Mahiva Raghunathan.
Do you think it might come as a shock to the F1 drivers? I know, like, we're talking about guys which are, for the most part, like a good 50% of the grid at least, are sort of like the best drivers in the world. But when they've been driving a formula they have done, where it's been very difficult to overtake, it's been difficult to follow, do you think it might be a shock to their system to actually have to race each other properly?
That's interesting. I mean, I think there could be some drivers out there that don't adapt, but from the sort of the limited exposure I've had to race drivers, is they're seriously competitive people.
Yeah.
I don't think they will forget how to overtake. They just lack the ability to demonstrate that often enough. And again, even if you look at the midfield this year, some of the racing, it's not all DRS overtakes, it's proper overtaking. And I mean, maybe a couple of the oldies might struggle to kind of pick up the pace again, but that's more to do with their career than to changing the cars.
I'm putting this out there that Romain Grosjean being closer to other cars will help no one.
The carbon fiber industry.
Well, at least now though, aren't they going to spray like wings and stuff with a rubber membrane to help to stop them exploding?
Yeah, there was some very vague comment in the regulations to try and prevent carbon debris going everywhere. They were going to do something like that. I don't know the detail of it, but I mean, it really depends on just how hard you hit something else, though, really, isn't it? I mean, if it's just a little touch, it may help, but when you're kind of really slapping into someone, or Ericsson has like punted you off, really hard, and you hit the barrier, then